Hello, my name is Garrett Coleman, and this is my multimedia final project on the film Babel. So the film Babel is a international crime psychological thriller film which depicts a lot of Western imperialism and multicultural layers. So this first link that we have is to an article about Western imperialism or global media project. So in this film, we travel from Morocco to the United States to Mexico and Japan. This article basically talks about how the different cultures were represented through globalization, corporatalization, economic standpoints, cultural beliefs, stereotypes, political climate. So it kind of touches down on how all of that is laid out throughout the film. Coming back here, though, I wrote about the cultural significance using this article. So, like I said, it's a multicultural influence. It spans across multiple different countries, personal conflicts, political conflicts. One of the largest overarching themes was the cultural influence of Islamophobia and the war on terrorism. So this film was made in the early 2000s, post 9/11, when the war on terrorism really influenced the Western media outlets. Our news and all of our films and stuff, a lot of them were incorporating this certain tone about Western superiority and fighting terrorism, which was stereotypically put specifically on Eastern culture. And kind of generalized to just about any culture that wasn't white. So in this, we can see that a lot of this was represented because of this outlook. We see it through the portrayals of their culture, which they demonstrate by showing Morocco and Mexico in only like poor rural areas, while on the other hand, Japan and California were showing beautiful homes and thriving communities influenced by this Western consumerism. After Susan was shot, one of the main characters in Morocco, the rest of the white Western tourists that were traveling there assumed they were also being targeted based off of their race, and they were very selfish in trying to leave Richard and Susan behind despite the trouble they were going through. The author does do a very good job at not centering the focus of the entire film on the Americans and their beliefs, but rather show through the actions of all of these interconnected and international characters how entire groups of people can get misunderstood through the media. When Susan was shot, the media coverage shown in the film through the use of news outlets covered it as a terrorist attack, when in reality it was just a young boy who was given a gun maybe before he was mature enough to be using it, and he made a stupid mistake, or a stupid decision, I would say, and decided to shoot at a bus, hitting Susan in the crossfire. We also see in this how Susan, being a white woman and an American, her injury became global news, but when the police were in pursuit of retribution and trying to find the offenders of this crime, they accidentally killed an innocent boy. And it's one of those things where the white life is prioritized over a colored life, and he didn't get any news coverage or anything about that. There's probably no investigation into the police that killed him or anything about that. But all the focus was put on, will she be okay? Even at the end of the film, they say Americans can rest easy now that they have a happy ending. So we see that common throughout this. Another instance where we see that this political environment really overshadows the film is the depiction of Mexico. So Mike is Richard and Susan's son, and he kind of proved this by reiterating that his parents told him Mexico is a dangerous place when Amelia, their trusted nanny since these kids were born, was trying to make it to her son's wedding in Mexico. The director really used this piece of dialogue strategically to contrast the loving celebration that we see in Mexico at this wedding before being emphasized by the crimes that finished the night when they are trying to return back to the United States and get stopped at the border because Amelia's nephew was drunk. Throughout multiple instances, we see that humans, despite the language or wherever they live, they can be good. Yes, mistakes are made, but as individuals, we cannot prejudge, or based on individual actions, we cannot prejudge entire cultures as being good or bad. What we see in the film and media is heavily influenced by our cultures, and not all people of color are criminals trying to infiltrate, and rather most are just simple people trying to survive in this complex world. So during the advertisement of the film, we got this quote in the trailer that if you want to be understood, listen, which ties into the next part of this, which is the New York Times article that emotion needs no translation. So in this article, the author kind of goes through and talks about the biblical story of Babel and in Genesis and everything, and then also ties it into the film techniques used by the director in portraying these cultures and how they go beyond the scope of linguistic division and physical division, but instead we see how interconnected the story is, and we can live through the emotions in our characters. So in this film, we see that this division persists, but we also see that the connectivity persists as well. The division was represented a lot by a juxtaposition of the landscapes and cultures as we traveled from Morocco to the United States, then Japan to Mexico. Each decision on how to represent the culture throughout the demeanor of the characters, economic depictions, and political environment enhance this division. We see through this that many of the sequences were shot using a handheld camera, which added a lot more emotion. As Susan bleeds out, Amelia and the kids are stranded in the desert, or Chieko is in the nightclub on drugs watching her crush make out with someone else. We get all these shaky camera work and imperfect focus on faces, and it lets us into the viewer's head. We get to see their thoughts. Chieko is a perfect example of this because she's a deaf mute, and so when she's in this nightclub, the sound is cutting in and out, and it goes out, and it takes you into what it would be like being a deaf mute person standing inside of a nightclub with raving music, strobe lights, and everything, and you get to see the emotion flash as the lights flash on her face as she's watching her crush make out with someone else. And this is after multiple attempts of trying to get a guy and being rejected because of her disability. We get to see this with Amelia and being told by Richard that she can't go to her son's wedding because of what happened to Susan, that she needs to stay, and he'll pay for a new wedding, just cancel it. Like she can't go, she can't leave the kids. But she is not being treated fairly. She's being expected to watch someone else's kids while her kid is having one of the happiest days of his life. So we see a lot of this where the camera work and everything is used to depict these emotions, these thought processes of when she's like, I'm gonna go regardless, and I'm just gonna have to take the kids with me. Like, come on, guys, it'll be a fun trip, you know. They also use sun glare and darkness and shadows to depict certain aspects of the cultures and the plot line happening at the moment as well, with solar flares flashing on the camera, showing the intensity of the environment when they're stranded in the desert or in the hills of Morocco, or the city lights at night shining through Japan, showing how beautiful it is, and it looks like a clean city, and the moonlight reflecting on the water. Everything like that was really good examples of how the techniques used to film portrayed the cultural and humanitarian aspects of what the film was trying to depict. We also got a lot of jump sequences where that cut back and forth in unchronological order, so we're finding out bits and pieces of information. It keeps it mysterious, it keeps you wanting to keep watching and find out what's going to happen, and creates a very deep and emotional story of humanity at its best and worst when it's divided or connected. So this is an image from the film where Richard is carrying Susan after she's shot in a local village, trying to get any help that he can to stop the bleeding before she dies. So this is a film review summary that really talks about the humanitarian condition. This one also goes going back, the imperialistic beliefs and the political climate at the time, as well as the filming and the emotions that transcend our characters. So during this one, we get a lot of interconnected and intercontinental characters, and we're allowed to experience a variety of human conditions, relationships, connections, responsibilities. The first scene where we see Susan, she's very Islamophobic. She's putting on hand sanitizer, throwing out the ice, doesn't trust the water, kind of being short with the people, doesn't want to be there. But we see nothing but hospitality from the locals. On the media, we only see these people as terrorists and the crime and the wars that are happening and the poverty. But in this, we see that despite the poverty and despite the world's view on their cultures, they are simple people. They are trying to just create a living and spend time with family and honestly just survive the best that they can. Obviously, there are some, which is what they show in this, is that there's some good and bad in everyone. With Amelia, for example, crossing the border, she loved these kids like they were her own. She thought they'd be safer with her, so she took a risk and brought them. We see how Richard's actions of not letting her do that created this contrast where she ended up being deported and he almost lost his kids, and so it created even more conflict by not trying to understand and listen to the other person. I think the film did an amazing job at authentically portraying these cultures of 4 different countries and the stereotypes associated with each that have been adopted by these cultures, and really portrays the message that we need to forget these stereotypes in order to understand life outside of our own and kind of help resolve conflict. So in this tweet, we see the example of the nightclub that I was telling you about, where Chiyoko is in the scene, and you can see and hear it. How they would portray a deaf mute viewing the situation in a nightclub. So a translation of this tweet is below, and it says, the stop motion effect produced by the flashing disco lights, the on and off sound, shows the first person point of view of the mute character and shows a transition from being happy to upset because of her crush kissing his friend instead of her. Down here is the official trailer for the film Babel. This film was very, very good in my personal response. I believe that in being born just after 9/11 and living in this political climate where this film, I'm very familiar with this climate that was portrayed throughout this film and this past 2 decades. Division more and more with the media and the portrayal of events happening around the world has also happened, and nowadays we are able to kind of look into it a little bit more and see if it is an accurate representation. We also see that in this film they're combating the stereotypes of the so-called kidnapping, the terrorism, and just proving that it was a young farm boy being given a gun before he was ready. The kidnapping of children was actually a nanny that had gone above and beyond for someone else's children and wanted to see her own. The rebellious actions of the deaf teenager were cries for help as she had no other way to be heard. So these are all emotions that we get despite not being able to actually live out these stories. I'll never know what it's like to be an immigrant or a person of color. May never know what it's like to be deaf or watch someone bleed out in front of me, but I know the emotion attached to it, and it helps portray the storyline and take you on a journey through the plot. And then finishing it off is a still image from the film in which this is the gun that started it all. This is one of the first shots that we get, and this sets up the rest of the film, where we get to see on the left Yusuf, the boy that shot Susan. Hassan in the middle is the guy that sold the gun. Ahmed is Yusuf's brother, who isn't very good with the gun and is more responsible, and then their father Abdullah standing next to them, who bought the gun and gave it to his sons and honestly feels pretty responsible for the things that happened, which was evident when they were trying to run from the police. Overall, this film was very good, and it was very perceptive on cultures with stereotypes while also showing the realistic aspects of these cultures and combating the stereotypes. Thank you.